Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show brought to you by GoldSilverBitcoin.com. We are more than honored to be sitting down today with Jeffrey Tucker. Jeffrey Tucker is one of the leading Austrian economics minds, if I dare say so myself, and he is also the president and founder of the Brownstone Institute. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for joining us today.
Oh, it's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me on your show.
Pleasure's all mine. I think we ran into each other many years ago at some Libertopias in sunny San Diego back when gathering was an act of defiance. So it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Are you sure it was during the pandemic? I don't think so. I think it was before.
Did I say that it was? It must have been in the 2010 or 2011.
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't think gathering. Well, anyway, I guess. But yeah, that was a fun event in those days. Yeah, and I guess probably we were thinking a lot about the inevitability of freedom and Bitcoin and that sort of thing, and then the lockdowns kind of hit us in the face and stopped progress for a couple of years.
Yes. So I want to ask about your interest in economics in general and what kind of lit that fire in you to learn about economics.
For me, it was I needed something other than music because I had sort of done music for a good part of my whole life, and I'm sorry, could you just get that? And I was looking for something else because I think my mother and father had just assumed I was going to be a musician, and I decided that I wanted to be something else, but I didn't know what that would be. So when I went to university, I just went from department to department. Philosophy seemed a little airy-fairy and a little bit pointless. History seemed just about the past, and the sciences, natural sciences, and so on, never really intrigued me because I didn't think there was enough that was changing about the world, or the natural world, to entice me towards any kind of imaginative study. So I went to the economics department. I didn't really know what it was, and I just asked the chairman of the department, what is economics? And he said, well, economics will unlock all the mysteries of the universe. Actually, it'll explain to you why it is that some nations get rich and some get poor, why people live long lives or short lives. They'll tell you everything. Economics tells you everything you need to know about thriving in this world and how that goes. And I thought, well, those are all the questions I have. And I don't have any of the answers, so economics will give that to me. So I began to study it, and I loved it. It was really fun, and only much later did I discover the Austrians. And I like the Austrians, especially that tradition of thought, not because it's got the right dogmas or the right doctrine, or it's correct about everything, or it's got perfect predictive ability, or that it's politically radical, but rather I like the focus on human beings and human choices. Which is very different from the economics that was being taught at the time. Now, I think it's very different today, but back in those days, it was all Keynesian hydraulics, so that people weren't actually doing anything. I mean, the people were nothing other than stick figures, that would labor, get paid, and then spend money. That was it. But they're sort of static parts of a machine, but not actually doing anything or responding to incentives, much less changing their values, based on institutional differences and things. And so the Austrian tradition had a much more sort of, I would say, sort of fleshy, sort of way about it, telling the stories of human beings as the driver of history and prosperity and that sort of thing, and that intrigued me. So I just stuck with it, and I never lost my love for the topic.
What kind of music did you like to play?
Well, back in those days, I was playing professionally in a jazz band, actually, and I made a lot of money doing that. I traveled with several jazz orchestras and that sort of thing. I had some unusual talents for my age, and then sort of squandered them by not practicing enough. Actually, I just kind of lost interest in it. This happens to people when this is actually a strange feature of why people choose the professions they do. Music was no longer a challenge to me. So I just got bored of it because I had all this ability. And I remember, and I'm not bragging, by the way, because it's just I had been playing, from a very early age. And my father was a musician, my brother was a musician, my mom's a musician. So, but the problem with things that come too easy to you is that you get bored with them. So it quite often happens, and I noticed this after I left music, that the people that have stuck with music weren't as I it sounds arrogant to say, but they weren't as gifted as I was, right? They weren't as good. But I thought about this later. It's a peculiar thing, why it is that people do what they do. And a lot of times people do something and they stick with it because they work really hard at it because they're not very good at it. And then eventually become good enough to compete in their realm. But there's a ton of people that are not in that realm that dropped out because they found it boring and they wanted to move on to something else challenging. So it's an ironic thing about the world that a lot of the people, the most successful people in the industry in which they work, are that way because they weren't sort of naturally good at that. There's areas where that they that they probably would have been better at, but they decided not to because it wasn't very much of a challenge. I mean, human beings need that kind of challenge. We're not just the wind-up toys. We don't come with built-in talents and then assigned to particular areas of life. We choose what we do for a reason, and so quite often we choose what we do because we're intrigued at our inability to do it very well, and so stick with it. So that was probably you could say that about me with economics, actually. But anyway, that's why I left. That's why I left music.
That's funny. So, there is a lot of at least imagery in entertainment, movies, for instance. There's also, even in many societies throughout the world, a reality in which the state essentially, when you're young, chooses what you're going to do for your whole life. And I didn't really figure out the way Europe worked when I was younger and there, but I learned about the way in which their schooling system worked. And it seems at a very young age, the idea is that you kind of pick what you're going to be doing for the rest of your life. And that's what you do. And then I think more kind of tangibly in movies, especially, we see this motif of like essentially the state choosing what you're good at and when you become obsolete or not. So I think there
Oh,
is.
it's disgusting. I mean, I think there's a lot of aspects of our world that are overly compartmentalized, and like I remember the very first time I ever filled out a tax form when I was paying my taxes. They wanted to know, what is it that you do, and I was like, really? There's a list, and sure enough, there is a list. So there's I don't know how long the list is. Let's say it's 300 possible things you can be, according to the tax rules. And I remember thinking, well, I don't know. I kind of, I'd rather have an identity of a person who's, doing a little of this and doing a little of that. And actually, that's pretty much been my career, I guess. I would describe myself as a writer editor, but I do a little bit of everything. I never gave up music entirely, by the way. I was the editor of a journal of music, managing editor for 10 years, and taught classes all over the world, and spoke at the Vatican, edited probably 40 different books on musical theory, that sort of thing. So, I mean, that's where my father was, and I'm sort of the same way. And I'd like to believe that we're moving into a world in which we're not constrained so much by this tendency to categorize us and stick us into little things, and that's what you're right. That's really what they've done to us. Is, we get born with a certain, it's all like, there was this movie, I forget now what the name of it was, but everybody's born into a sort of role and they have to discover your innate skills, and then you get plugged into certain groups. I forget now what the name of that movie was. Typical dystopian book, but it's actually our reality. So you figure out your aptitudes. That was the way they did when I was young. What can you read? Are you good at math? That sort of thing. And then they put you in an accelerated program. And then they say, well, now you have to go here. Now you have to go here. So, okay, well, I'm glad it's through with high school. Well, now you have to go to college. Well, now I'm done with college. What do I do? Well, now you have to go to law school or med school or something. And so, and then whatever whatever your degree is in then becomes, your identity and your profession. And, there's a guy behind you with a whip the rest of your life saying work, work, work. I just don't. I don't like to. One of the beautiful things about a dynamic entrepreneurial growing economy is that people don't have to get stuck this way. And I sense that old world of lifetime categorization has been gradually coming apart now for decades, and especially during this pandemic response over the last 2 years, people have just uprooted their lives. They're like, okay, I'm out of New York. I'm getting out of here. I'm gonna move to Texas. I'm moving to Florida. I'm gonna change professions. It's the state disruptions have been so extreme that they've invited people to make extreme disruptions in their own lives too. That's sort of been the effect. It's like, okay, you think you can lock me in the house? You think you can shut my business? You think you can restrict my travel? Well, I'm going to start thinking new things too about how I'm going to manage my life. Maybe I'll just get the hell out of Dodge. Maybe I'll leave Oregon. And go to South Carolina. This has been going on. Millions and millions and millions of people have done this. Really rethought exactly what is the meaning of life and how that relates to our profession and our work.
It's been fascinating to watch that play out. You're talking about the tax form, and I imagine like some short stories starting with the character like going through the list of 300 things, and then when his thing doesn't appear on the list, he goes on it. He has an existential crisis and starts pondering what it is that he does in life. And it has blown my mind watching over the last 2 years, approximately, the amount in which I guess collectivism, we could call it, has sort of ingratiated itself into our lives in every facet of the imagination. Almost, you can, for instance, look at this fight over the public schools, and then is anybody even questioning the concept of public schools and from where it came at all? And a lot of people who would call themselves like anti-socialist are in fact acting out a form of socialism, and that's in terms of at least the public school system as just one example. And then in terms of kind of the, I guess, migratory patterns, but also, like, I think you put it very nicely. Well, you think you can do these things, well, we're going to think new thoughts too. I there's a concept that I believe it's kind of popularized in the modern American imagination, like via the CIA, of blowback. So when you do something, maybe in another country, there's going to be some response, equal or opposite reaction. And I think we are now seeing that blowback play out, and it's really a kind of historical and world changing. And it's quite crazy seeing this tug of war be fought, as Noam Chomsky has put it, where there's always kind of like the totalitarians who are like seeking to, implement more controls over a society. And there's always the people who are kind of trying to have a freer, more flexible society. And these two forces often kind of are in a tug of war. That's just the way he put it. But I think certain people might critique that view. They might say that's a Marxist view, but I do sense that we are seeing that.
Right. I believe that entirely, which, gets us to why it is that we've lived through the last 2 years that we have. And I think a lot of it was really kind of a ruling class fed up with the chaos that had been created out of digital innovation, and among which Bitcoin but just this sort of the rising sense that people had of their own freedoms. And it's like, I think there's a certain ruling class out there that just said, at the first opportunity, to remind the world who's boss, and that boss is the state and its corporate elites backing the state, and vice versa. So I think there was a kind of a reactionary drive here, to put us all back in cages, because of the digital revolution. The communications technology smashed the media elites. So we're crushing the money monopolies. Corporations were facing increasing competition from a whole range of blockchain-based products, and there's just a lot going on. And it just seemed like, the referees just suddenly blew the whistle, said, okay, everybody just stop doing everything, and yeah, and you speak of education, there's, growing emphasis on homeschooling and private schooling and mixed hybrid models of education. There was a lot of great things happening in the world. And it's like some people just said, no, you're going to all go back to your cages. But I agree with you too but this is also creating a kind of a wild blowback. I mean, they definitely overreached. It went too far, and people are mad. I mean, you're starting to see the opinions change. I mean, I'm intrigued by the Canadian trucker revolt, for example. I mean, I woke up this morning, there was an article saying, oh, it's not going to make any difference. Canadians are the most boring people ever. They don't have any opinions about anything. they're not political people. And they consider this trucker revolt to be just some sort of tacky explosion of unseemly radicalism, and they're going to go back to sleep now. Well, then an hour later, I read a poll showing a dramatic swing in public opinion in Canada against restrictions. Okay, there were, 2 weeks ago, a majority for restrictions. Now, 2 weeks later, a majority is against restrictions. So it did in fact have a huge impact on public opinion. And I think this is what happens. I mean, if you live your life in a cage, and you get acculturated to it, you get used to it. But then somebody puts the idea of freedom in your ear, and you're like, well, maybe I could have that. And you start to imagine it, then you start to demand it, and the next thing you know, you're free. So I think you're right. We're going to experience a huge blowback from this. And in fact, I think if we can have a little bit of patience right now, and I'm talking about, a year, 2, maybe as much as 5, I think we're going to see the birth of a completely new world, one with a scared ruling class, intimidated politicians, and investigations about the administrative state and what they're wanting, and a great suspicion about elites and what they want to do to us. So, to me, we're on the verge of a kind of a great revolutionary moment in human history towards human emancipation, and I think it's all been provoked by this overreach of the ruling class.
Yeah, it seems it would, behoove this ruling class to put ideas in the minds of people that there is no hope for the future of humanity, that this is what it is and will forever be. However, I think there's millions of us out there that have been watching this aghast and also kind of not so thinking that they overreached in a way in which did more damage to their agendas than otherwise. It's interesting to me the way in which we're told stories about all the different nations now. For instance, a lot of us aren't able to travel. I mean, can you believe the way in which travel was shut down? It was unimaginable. And
it was March 12th. It was March 12th, 2020. And it all came, I didn't even know the president had this kind of power. But the president gave a nationwide address in the United States and said, starting Monday, this is on Thursday, he said, starting Monday, there will be no more travel from Europe. What? Or Australia or New Zealand or the UK. And I thought, you don't restrict the right of travel that way. I mean, that the freedom of travel is a human right that's rarely restricted, except it maybe in wartime or something. But it was outrageous and beyond belief, actually. And the president at that time was Trump, and I don't care what your views are on him, but there was something disgusting about the sort of ego rush he experienced that night giving that talk. And I don't know if you remember that, but he had prepared remarks, and what he was supposed to say is that this only affects business travel and entertainment travel, whatever you want to call it, tourism, but it's not going to affect commercial exchange and trade. But he didn't say that. That's what the text said. Instead, he mangled the words and said that it also affects all trade in commercial goods. Well, I mean, that caused the stock markets to go absolutely insane and the White House to do all kinds of spin. But the message was sent already. It's like, okay, we the president misstated something, Okay, that's good. I mean, it's good to know that it was a misstatement. But wait, do we really have dictators that have that level of power that you can just shut down world trade, with an announcement on TV? Is that really the world in which we live? So it was a shock to discover that. And I don't think any of us really want to live in that kind of world. And we have constitutions and legislatures and courts and elections for a reason. And the reason for that is to limit the ability of autocrats to exercise dictatorial power over our lives. So it seems it's been obvious to me ever since, at very least, that moment, that we need radical reform to restore, basic human rights and freedoms.
Some things that I think the ruling class is resentful of right now is the homeschooling trend that you highlighted. I mean, I'm a new father, and we certainly have no intention of sending our child even to a private school, which is licensed by the state in order to operate. Also, I think leaving the hospital system, I think people are increasingly skeptical of hospitals and the medical system. And it's quite interesting to see the way that Medicare and Medicaid has made hospitals beholden to state policy in the last 2 years. They're not independent organizations by
Right.
any means. And then
Now let's back up slightly on your schooling point, because I think this is one of the most interesting features of the present realities, that I don't entirely understand. Like, one of the things I'm really interested in that intrigues me is when I see powerful people fail to get their way. And I'm thinking about this in terms of the public schooling issue. So when the pandemic came along, one of the very first things that they did was shut down schools. Now, I mean, it's strange because we know epidemiologically that SARS-CoV-2 was of no threat to children whatsoever. And there's, Sweden kept schools open the entire time with no masks, and there's not a single incident of death, out of that. And they have the best record ever. So, I mean, we knew this already from early February, what the incidents, what the threat was to school-age kids, and it was almost non-existent. And they shut them anyway. And now the reason they shut them was because the pandemic planners had models that had been very much premised on the idea of social distancing, and were not adjusted for the gradients of risk relative to demographics at all. These models were just very strict. And they said if everybody just stays 6 feet apart, then the germ will, not spread or something like that. So, and school kids are especially egregious because they ride on buses together. Really, they were talking like this. They ride on buses together, sit close together at desks, and then they play in the playground. They'll do nothing but spread germs. It was like exactly like a cootie style model of infectious disease. And so they shut down the schools. Now, I couldn't believe it, because if you think back to the history of progressivism, to the history of the role of the state and society, one of the very first things that I guess you would call like the modern state did after the birth of liberalism and so on, then there's this kind of reactionary movement designed to push the state, to give the state extra powers it didn't previously have. So one of the very first things that came out, even before regulation of drugs and food and all that kind of stuff, was public schools. And this is in the 1870s and 1880s. So they put in place public schools. Now, 150 years later, they were still, I would say, like the crown jewel of progressivism. It's true that they're 3-5 times more expensive than private schools. It's true a lot of kids get dropped through the cracks, and not that anybody cares about the poor anymore, apparently. They'd failed by any kind of scientific test, but at least in terms of popular perception, the public schools was like one of the great triumphs of progressivism. So when the very first thing that happened after lockdowns was the shutting of the public schools, I thought, wow, that is extremely weird, because it's not going to do anything other than undermine public trust in their schools. I mean, and a lot of people's lives are structured around the expectation their kids are going to go to school at a certain time and come home at a certain time, right? Make sure your kid gets on the bus, drop them off at school, hire somebody to pick them up. They're going to get a carpool on the way home. They're going to stay home for an hour, or I'm going to leave work early, whatever. And that was the way people's lives were structured. So when they shut the schools, it's like, wait, what now? What do I do? I can't. So that when they shut the schools, then they had to shut the workplaces also. So it's like, well, mom and dad, you can work from home. Well, that applies to about a third of the American public, right? The professional Zoom class, people can do their work on computer, but it doesn't apply to 2/3 of the others. So, what happened? We saw the largest dropouts of women, working women from the labor force in history by far. We lost, 30 years of progress in terms of women going out into the workforce. We're back to something like, last time we looked at the data, 1985 levels of women's labor participation. They just dropped out. Because why? Because they had to take care of. Now, so, think about this. It's just almost mind-boggling. So here you have sort of scientific progressives, people who love the state power, managing the pandemic response. And they're like pushing these buttons on it out. Well, let's close the schools. All right, what are we going to do with the kids? Well, we have to close the malls because they hang out in the malls. Well, but the parents have to go to work. Well, we'll close the workplaces too. So they push all these buttons. And then what comes out on the other end? Women leaving the workforce in droves, reversing 30 years of another progressive priority, which was, to get women with children out there in the workplace. And so everything just kind of blew up on itself, It was just a remarkable series of things. And the effect of that has been a huge, huge boom in homeschooling. So homeschooling, which existed under a cloud previously, then suddenly became mandatory, because what else are you going to do? You have to teach your kid at home. They're not going to really turn on a computer and learn from somebody on the screen. It's ridiculous. So the parents started teaching the kids. So homeschool became mandatory. And then after 6 months or 8 months of this nonsense, people started looking around for private schools, even though they're being taxed for public schools. Now they're going to have to pay tuition again. So private schools all across the country just, suddenly filled up with students. They had financial problems in the past. Suddenly all the problems are gone. They began to hire new teachers and that sort of thing. So I guess, to me, it's one of the most extraordinary results of all these policies is that they've ended up, producing a huge explosive interest in everything except public schools, which in some parts of the country have been closed for the better part of 2 years. Unbelievable.
I imagine that, as these decisions were made, there's psychologists who are tasked with running models to kind of see what might happen. And before that point, even all of the predictions are based off of models. And I think we've seen a great problem with modeling data and then coming to conclusions, because the conclusions are often wrong. There's not enough fleshiness in these models, it seems. It's almost kind of this, I guess it's almost a technocratic, but it's maybe scientific minded, or even in the spirit of the way in which Keynesians kind of see economics.
No, it's very similar.
And at least the models we get are wrong time and time again, whatever it is about. Whenever I would call it the state enterprise apparatus comes with data to make a point and say that, we need to steer this ship humanity in a certain direction, the models are often needing to be reworked. Can you kind of speak to the problem with that and the need for the kind of Austrian style fleshiness when it comes to understanding human action?
Yeah, the analogy between epidemiological modeling and macroeconomic modeling is so very, very close. And I began to notice this early on when I began to look at these epidemiological models. They don't adjust for demographic differences. I'll just give you one example. SARS-CoV-2 was really impactful on elderly populations. Well, if you live in a continent or a country without elderly populations, or with a very small percentage of populations, that drives the case fatality ratio, dramatically down. Certainly, infection fatality ratio. So you can, so in a place like in a continent like Africa, which is a very, very young population, people don't live that old. Actually, is what that means. The infection fatality rate is like 0.00, I don't know what, 1%. I mean, it's very, very low. And then you have other countries like in Asia where obesity is far less of a problem, with a much lower IFR, CFR than you're going to get in the United States. So anyway, so none of these models are accounting for the demographic heterogeneity as the disease impacts people. And in terms of the costs of these policies, like you talk about the costs, the psychological costs on the children for locking down, those were never part of the models, and that's typical of economic models too. They don't consider the possibility that something could go wrong, and so they don't consider the costs. And so if they're not considering the costs, they're not weighing the costs against the benefits. So in other words, they're not acknowledging trade-offs. There's a presumption behind all these models that here's the inputs, here's my dial, here's the outputs, boom, you're done. And none of that accords with reality. I mean, the inputs are so heterogeneous, and the variables basically infinite, that there's absolutely no way that you can put these into any kind of model. You may choose the wrong moving parts. Just because you have a computer model that works on a screen, does not mean that ports over to real life at all. And so I saw these analogies working, 100%. In fact, it was kind of interesting because I have a lot of friends who are economists, like high-end economists, who work with modeling, trained in mathematical modeling techniques, which I never was. And they tell me that epidemiological models are about 30 years behind the economic ones. Like, at least within the profession of economics, they've tried to improve them with better and better techniques, and certain techniques for trying to distinguish between a pure correlation and the likelihood that variables are actually one thing is causing another, the plausibility of causative agents here, and that the models have gotten better over the decades. But this is epidemiology from an epidemiological point of view. This is their first journey, their first test of the modeling. And modeling only in epidemiology only came about in about 20 years ago. Yeah, it was the first time anybody began to use this kind of sophisticated computer modeling in epidemiology. And this is the first attempt, to try to compare it against real world outcomes. And it's all blown up. It's just an unbelievable disaster. I mean, I think we're up to something like 140 studies, some meta studies, some just straight country by country studies, that have failed to show any relationship whatsoever between virus outcomes and pandemic policies. I mean, which is another way of saying that it was all pointless. And in that sense, it really fits very well with Keynesian style macroeconomic planning, which was embarked upon with great earnestness in the 1930s, and then periodic attempts ever since. But it's they've been unable to observe in reality anything like what they imagined to work in theory, and that speaks to the Austrian point. Austrians are all about uncertainty, about processes, about human choice, and the difficulty of modeling the creative imagination. So yeah, Austrian economics doesn't give you a precise way to run the world. What they say is every way you might imagine that you can manage the world proves to be futile in light of the reality of human experience.
I was posting a prior episode on a couple Reddits recently. Our America, our USA. Oh no, it's our freedom and our liberty, and then our communism, because the topic was the latter. And the first two just let me post, and left it to the crowd to downvote me or say I was spam. But the third one, I had to go through the moderators, which I thought was fitting. Now, something that kind of bothers me now, I moved from California to Idaho. And so things are much different here. It's, I think, what I would call a much more reasonable approach to a pandemic, if you will. And so I'm seeing reports now coming out that, studies are finding developmental lag in babies born during the pandemic. They scored lower on a test of motor and social skills at 6 months than those who hadn't been born in a pandemic. I see another story here in The Guardian, quote, "My son cowers when a shopkeeper says hello. Are the toddlers of COVID all right?" But we have a solution, Jeffrey. Interactive screen time to prevent speech and language delay in toddlers. So, all these dystopic movies that I've seen and books I've read are looking more like premonitions than fiction. And I was wondering, do you have any, on the arts and entertainment side, do you look at art any differently than maybe these days, or just in general? Do you see kind of these like timeless themes in art and movies?
I don't understand how it is that we could have, through most of our adult lives, seen countless dystopian movies warning about totalitarianism, categorizing people, dictatorships, sticking people in sector 1, sector 2, and so and then it's almost like all those movies became a model for how the pandemic response was. It's like we tried to recreate them, in real time, and it's been a catastrophe. And in terms of art and creativity and music and that sort of thing, I mean, like just sheer stuff of civilization, we've nearly lost 2 years. I mean, it's just been a tragedy. And I think back to a pandemic that happened in my own lifetime, which was 1968, 1969. I think they called it the Asian
Hong
flu.
Kong flu?
Hong Kong flu, yeah, I guess so. But that was that. It broke out in December. They were planning Woodstock, to occur in the summer. There was not a single thought put to the idea that you would cancel that. I mean, it was obviously you were going to go ahead with it, and there were doctors in hand and that sort of thing. And there was a great deal of, it was a really, really, really bad flu year. It was actually a pandemic flu, but we went ahead with civilization anyway, and Woodstock took place and set the stage for 30 years of musical creativity. So what we've lost over the last 2 years is just, it's mind-boggling to think. And in terms of the impact on kids' lives, I can't even, it's almost unfathomable, what happened. And even now, I mean, you say you moved from California. I think most kids in California are still in masks, even as we're speaking, which is just an amazing. I remember the first time I ever saw a kid in a mask, I was like, are we out of our minds? What are we doing? Because I had read the demographics of this thing. I mean, if you're really protecting them, okay, I get it, maybe. But kids need exposure. They need exposure to germs. Otherwise, they're gonna die. Otherwise, they need. I mean, that's why our immune systems, they work through practice. They don't work through avoidance of normal respiratory viruses. I mean, this is for most kids it was for almost all was never a threat. Yeah, we're telling them to be afraid of each other and be afraid of adults. The adults are poison to them, and they are poison to grandma, and so on. I mean, the messaging of this thing, I don't know. I don't know how you get out of a trauma like that. I mean, that's a huge trauma to occur to hundreds of millions of kids, billions of kids worldwide in their formative years, and there's other evidence that basically for a lot of kids, they lost 2 years of their education. Now, I think you can make that up with a certain degree of passion and dedication, that sort of thing. But the damage is just an incredible thing. And this is done by the experts, right, in the name of science. Now, what does that do to your trust in the experts and science? I mean, I don't know how anybody could believe or trust after something like this.
I spoke with professor of organic chemistry, Dave Collum, and he is an example of somebody who went from being quite trustful of the experts to not trusting a single one. And he also raised that question. And then with the children, like it's not that they aren't going to know what happened in US history. It's I think that's going to ultimately be a huge problem. It's rather the lack of human connection, of seeing people's faces, and the way in which that has divided us has actually been quite effective. And um,
Well, it's kind of what the state wants, right? It wants us to be all afraid of each other and utterly and completely reliant on the elites. I think that's, I mean, I'm not saying anybody intended to do that, but it's consistent with what you imagine that the ruling class impulses would be, you know, to just turn us all into fearful people, you know, huddling at home afraid. It's just like in that movie was V for Vendetta. It was exactly the same sort of thing, make everybody just terrified all the time. And that's sort of what they did to us. I mean, it's just incredible. So you talk about blowback. I think there's going to be an enormous blowback against all this stuff, and it's going to take interesting forms. I mean, one is going to be politically. We're going to see a whole generation of leaders just wiped out, is my guess, in media and big tech, all the censors who have censored everybody off Twitter, and I think there's going to be a blowback against all that. But in government, especially, a tremendous upheaval. And I don't mean just the Republicans are going to take over the Democrats, which is very obvious. It's that I think the Republican elites themselves are going to be wiped out by a new generation of people who, you know, just are in shock about what happened and how it is that this is allowed to happen to us. We're going to see new kinds of judges being appointed by the new political leaders. But even that, I don't think is the most impactful change. I think there's going to be a kind of a cultural revolution that we're eventually going to get to. We're not anywhere near that yet, but we're eventually going to come. Once we look back and realize what happened and ferret out, you know, the causative elements and the names of the elites and the institutions who backed this and pushed it and did this to us, there's going to be hell to pay. Just like after World War I, you know, we spent a good part of the 1920s with people just in a state of fury about what World War I meant, you know, within terms of the draft and the inflation and the controls and the speech controls and the number of people who were arrested for opposing the war and everything, and the war profiteering that took place. You know, it was a scandal. So this is one of the major reasons why people are so reluctant to enter World War II in the US, because they saw war as being a gigantic scam. So they want another war. So you know, Europe was practically painted black before Americans, and even then Americans wouldn't go to war in Europe. They were fed up with it. So they had to use the pretext of going, you know, of the you know, war against Japan and Pearl Harbor in order to, you know, get Americans to even consider it. So this is the problem with these kinds of pandemic responses. I mean, you know, if there ever comes a time in the future where there is, in fact, which it won't happen, but if that should happen, that we really have a genuine plague that would require, you know, that's got a 50%, 30 to 50% case fatality rate, which will never happen. But if it could, I don't believe there will ever be another lockdown. I mean, it just can't happen. You won't be able to persuade people to go along with this stuff because we went through this fake theater for 2 years that ended up being just absolutely devastating. We lost probably close to 250,000 small businesses. I mean, it's just incredible. I mean, you go to Manhattan today, none of the old restaurants are there. I mean, it's an astounding thing. There are whole towns that, you know, spent a good better part of a year, you know, shut down. I mean, just main streets and small, medium-sized towns where all the businesses are gone. I had friends of mine that ran very large, successful companies that were just completely wrecked. You know, and where's the compensation for that? You know, where's the justice? I don't know. I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see how things flesh themselves out.
Yeah, the stakes certainly have been raised, and I think a couple of things. So motive, this is a fundamental part of a criminal case in a court when you're arguing about it or charging somebody with it. The consistency of motive and action I think is something that is always vocalized and discussed and pointed to as a grounds for punishment. And then when it comes to like children wearing masks, I think it's like that we have a narcissism problem. So there's a bunch of people running around thinking they're self-important and that they're special, and that in order to maintain this kind of view of themselves, that they listen to the experts because they're smarter than the others, and that's how we end up with children walking around in masks when the data is so, I guess, just unconvincing that
Yep.
that's the direction to go towards.
A major problem in a bureaucratic state is the inability to assign responsibility. It's always committees and there are always guidelines. And then there's some other agency that says, well, what does the other committee say? Oh, here's the guidelines. Well, that's going to be the new rule. And then somebody else says, well, the new rule from this committee and that committee and that committee would now becomes our mandates. And then, but you can't find out who's actually responsible for this. This is a major problem with these court cases, is that you can't find anybody to take responsibility. I mean, you think of all people would be Anthony Fauci would be the one who would be, you could claim was responsible. But Senator Rand Paul asked him in a hearing the other day, he said, look, you're the architect of this entire policy. I mean, you should bear some responsibility for it. And he demurred. He claimed he was not the architect of this. He was merely passing on guidelines that had been already approved by the CDC. So you see how this works, right? Nobody's actually responsible. And this is what we're going to be going through. I mean, the same thing they went through at the Nuremberg trials, trying to figure out who was responsible for the Holocaust. It's actually much more difficult than it seems. You think you just point to people and they're like, well, I never get that order. I never get that. Well, I was just following orders, and so on. So you can't find anybody who's willing to accept responsibility for these outrages in an overly bureaucratized administrative state. This is going to be a major problem we're going to be facing over the next 5 years.
It's amazing. I've actually come to the conclusion that history rhymes it's a euphemism, if a phrase can be a euphemism, and that history actually does repeat. So for instance, we've got videos online of people saying they're just doing their job. And it's like, really? Like the same exact line? And then someone told me the other day that when they see something like NYPD doing sweeps of restaurants for people not presenting vaccination cards, that they just forget that. They delete that from their memory, an exact quote. And it's like, that's exactly how this stuff perpetuates itself. So
yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the Brownstone Institute. What are you doing with the Brownstone Institute?
So I started it in light of, I consider the pandemic lockdowns as being kind of a new chapter in history. I mean, it was a trauma that we never expected to experience. And I've just noticed that there's a funny way in which people are unwilling to come to terms with the reality of change. A lot of what we believed to be true in 2019 turned out not to be true in 2020. And I really wanted an institution with a fresh start that could just really look at what I would call like the liberal project, which is another way of saying, just the aspirations of the human heart to be free, with a different lens. Whatever we weren't unable to protect ourselves from what happened to us in 2020, and I think part of the failure is intellectual. So the purpose of the Brownstone is to come to terms with what's happened to us in every area, whether it's economics or culture or epidemiology or anything. And I have many top experts and scientists writing for Brownstone, but then also to work after all this is over on the rebuilding process. What can we learn out of this experience? What does it look like to fix up the world in a way in which we can recover and make sure nothing like this ever happens again? So I founded Brownstone with that purpose in mind, because I saw a hole in the market. There weren't people that do incredible research on this and reporting on important studies that were coming out and giving ongoing commentary about this in a way that helps others make sense of the world and gives an outlet to a lot of the scientists who have been pushed out of their institutions or otherwise censored. So that was the purpose of Brownstone. And now I thought of it in May of 2021. I opened the doors on August 1st. And since that time, we've had close to 8 million page views. So it's been an enormous success. And I only run probably 1 in 10 submissions I get. You know, it can't keep up. So I'm desperately trying to get us to the next stage. I mean, I feel like it's like a tiger by the tail at this point. It's so popular, and it's doing, I would say, really important work. I don't think it's possible that we can really recover out of this period of our lives without a good intellectual understanding and a renewed foundation that believes in what I thought we all believed in the past, namely human rights and basic freedoms. But for some reason, we lost conviction over those subjects, and that's one of the reasons we were so vulnerable to what happened to us. And we've got to change that, or else we're gonna find ourselves in a new dark age. So that's what Brownstone's about. It's about preventing that new dark age and trying to show the light.
8 million page views. Wow. So I said earlier that some of the things the ruling class might be resentful of is the homeschooling, the increasing distrust in the medical system. And then also, I think the amount of small businesses that have been, I think there was like a big leap in the amount of small businesses that were, I guess, registered. And I think that's a third point that the ruling class might be resentful of. So now, with all these new business owners, many of whom are probably doing digital businesses, can you kind of speak to like what made Brownstone successful?
Well, I've had a lot of experience in managing social media and managing email lists and that sort of thing. So there's a technological element here. I've learned how to play in this world. But more than anything else, I think it's because we were saying things other people were not saying before anybody else was saying them. So it's the credibility of the research. My reprints are just going through the roof everywhere. I mean, the Epoch Times ran this morning a piece I had published on early treatment, for example, that examines things like ivermectin and fluvoxamine and doxycycline and hydroxychloroquine and these kind of things. What does the research say about these early treatments that are repurposed drugs? What are the credible studies and what are they reporting? So there was not anybody else doing this kind of work. So I just put it out there and it's being reprinted and looked at all over the place. So I think it's more than anything else, it's just, I would say, the integrity of the research, the relevance of the content, speaking to the moment, and being nonpartisan about it, just saying, look, what did we used to think we agreed on? Freedom of association, freedom of speech, sanctity of the home, religious freedom. You can't shut our churches. Those basic sort of principles, just reasserting them against the outrageously implausible demands of lockdowns and mandates. So I think that's it. As I was driven, it's more content than anything else.
History. I obviously have a grounding in history. So history is what I studied in college, and I did a lot of extracurricular, which helped. And that ultimately led me to Austrian economics, libertarianism type ideas. And so now I've concluded increasingly that the reason why we have lost our way and are not passionate anymore about kind of these ideas of Western civilization, especially, I guess, the American Rebellion, the Declaration of Independence, individuality, self-reliance, is because we have a money system whose currency is consistently being devalued over time. And so we're more than happy to fork over these paper bills for the newest TV, the newest iPhone, and then we basically exist our lives consuming media that's produced by an increasingly fewer number of entities. And so I think that's the way we've lost our way. Now, Bitcoiners, that's one way in which we have. Now, Bitcoiners argue that because we have a deflationary currency, and I have to have that Bitcoin question because I'm making a documentary and I want to put you in it. And there's some other comments you've made earlier that'll probably fit also. So this is the Bitcoin question. And so they're saying it's a deflationary currency. It's kind of the remedy to this reckless money printing, which creates reckless consumers, if you will. People become more reckless, and it's worse for the environment. If the environment is something that you care about, then Federal Reserve printing billions and billions of dollars, trillions and trillions of dollars, something you should be concerned about and learn about. So I guess, what are your thoughts about Bitcoin, and how much of a role could it play at this detour where we can head towards Renaissance?
It's provided a source of hope. It's not lost on people that Bitcoin never shut down. I mean, there's not a single blip. The whole world's been in upheaval for 2 years, and Bitcoin just kept chugging along. I mean, there was no interruption in the blockchain. Everything just went on as always. And that's very important. And the reason for that is that it's not controlled by a central party. And you say it's deflationary. I mean, that's another way of saying that it gets more and more valuable relative to goods and services, and that's a good thing. So the fact that it's the rate at which you can increase Bitcoin is on a protocol rather than up to the discretion of big shots leads to a greater degree of trust. So you don't have to trust the science. You can, or the ruling class. You trust the protocol. And so that's extremely important. I think these experiments we're starting to see with Salvador going on a Bitcoin standard and that sort of thing are going to be very interesting to watch. And I assume that the future is with cryptocurrency. And I don't think that any state is going to be able to come up with a crypto to compete with the existing market alternatives. Many years ago when email began to get popular, there was an attempt by the post office to create its own email system for the public, and it flopped, immediately because everybody was already using the private system. So I think the same thing is going to happen with Bitcoin. We're going to see a lot of attempts by the Fed and Bank of England and so on to create their own cryptocurrencies, and they will use blockchains to send tokens around. That's true, but that's really different from a public blockchain that's not controlled by anybody. Those are really different products. So I think the banks will end up using these cryptocurrencies just simply because they're cheaper and quicker. They're not cheaper to build; they're expensive to build, but they're much cheaper to use. So 5 years, 10 years, we'll see all the banks using blockchain style systems for check clearing and that sort of thing. But it's not the same thing as Bitcoin. It's not the same thing as the cryptocurrencies. Those are very different products. We already have what we need to completely reinvent the monetary system, and eventually, I assume that the very well could be that we'll see money entirely privatized, but there's going to be a long period of transition in which we're going to have parallel systems.
We've had the honor of sitting down today with Jeffrey Tucker. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for sitting down with me. It's been a pleasure. And you can find Jeffrey's work on Twitter at Jeffrey A. Tucker and also at brownstone.org right now. So thank you so much, Jeffrey, for joining us today.
Okay, such a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.